The Grey River Argus on the 29th of September, 1908, reported the following, quote, "The vessel lost at Cape Portland was the Loch Finlas, bound from Port Pirie to Callao. Residents state that at about 9:30 o'clock on Saturday morning, a barque was seen coming from the direction of Boobyalla Bay. She struck the reef, and within half an hour had disappeared."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? Captain Lonnen stops with Loch Finlas.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Loch Finlas was an iron-hulled barque that had been built in Southampton in 1885. The 2,170-ton vessel had started life under the name Barque before she was acquired by the Loch Finlas Shipping Company in 1900, leading to a change in her name. The Loch Finlas's home port was Liverpool, but she had no consistent route. This particular voyage had begun in Hamburg, where she had changed captains. Her original captain, Captain Neen, had departed from the Loch Finlas in Hamburg to take command of a different vessel, and Captain Lonnen had taken his place. It was under the command of Captain Lonnen that they departed from Hamburg and made their way to Melbourne. Captain Lonnen was an experienced captain, having gone to sea at the age of 12, and worked his way up. While they were in Melbourne, he celebrated his 66th birthday, and he was starting to have thoughts of retirement. Indeed, he had spoken to a friend of his about not wanting to even finish this final voyage on the Loch Finlas, which would not be returning to England for some time yet. He talked of handing the command of the ship over to his first mate, Logan, and buying himself a passage back home where he would retire and spend time with his wife, who was in ill health. Captain Lonnen's thoughts of retirement might have been urged along by the terrible weather they had experienced for the entire voyage from Hamburg to Melbourne. Due to the poor weather, the voyage had taken them unusually long 125 days, and it caused further delays in Melbourne due to needing $1,000 in ship repairs to be completed first. During this time, there would also be some crew turnover. 4 of the sailors would depart from the ship, and they would sign on new sailors to take their place, bringing their company to a total of 25 men, including the captain. The Loch Finlas had arrived in Melbourne on the 15th of May, and departed on the 21st of July, bound for Port Pirie in ballast to pick up her next cargo. Captain Lonnen had not acted on his desire to leave the ship at Melbourne, but the bad weather that had plagued his voyage up until this point had not left them. The voyage would take them 15 days, and several of their sails needed to be replaced during that time. Captain Lonnen wrote a letter to a friend in Melbourne, simply saying that the weather had been, quote, very bad. They were able to reach Port Pirie safely, though, and take on their cargo of 30,000 bags of wheat, bound for Callao, Peru. The weather was finally fine as they departed from Port Pirie on the 16th of September. The good weather would only hold through the 16th. The day after they left Port Pirie, the weather would once again become stormy, and for several days the storm would not abate. Twice they were forced to hove so that they could better ride out the weather. The weather then calmed for a short time, and they were able to turn their course to the Bass Strait. This turn of good weather was not going to last either, though, and 2 days later they were forced to hove to for 2 days straight to ride out another serious storm. As evening fell on Friday, the 25th of September, they were once again able to continue their voyage. But the crew would state that at this point, Captain Lonnen had not been sober for days. Though he had not handed command over to his first mate, and left the ship in Melbourne as he had spoken of, he had still primarily left the duty of managing the ship to First Mate Logan all the same, as the storms that had dogged their voyage continued to thwart them. Able-bodied sailor Gustav Carlsen would say that from 6 in the morning to 8 in the morning he had been at the helm of the ship and that the wind was still strong from the west, but that the sea was not particularly stormy any longer. At 8 a.m., he went below to rest, and so he was not entirely certain what happened next. What he did know was that at 9 a.m. there was a sudden heaving and bumping. The ship had struck on one of the reefs of Foster Island, near Cape Portland. First Mate Logan had been the only officer on deck when the vessel struck, but Captain Lonnen did look out of the companionway after the collision was felt on the ship. He did not emerge or offer any sort of instruction. He instead turned around and went back below, leaving First Mate Logan and Second Mate Rogers to try to organize the now somewhat alarmed sailors. First Mate Logan ordered the launching of the lifeboats without any support from Captain Lonnen. The ship's carpenter, a man named Reeder, had come up after investigating and reported that the hold was full of water already. Both First Mate Logan and Second Mate Rogers got to work organizing the evacuation of the ship, while telling the crew not to panic, and to do everything calmly and quietly, which did have the desired effect of maintaining order. It was felt by the officers the ship was likely to remain on the reef for some time, and therefore there was no need to rush the launching of the boats. Without seeming urgency, the mates began to get the work lowering the boats with the crew, but the first two that they lowered were both smashed in the breakers. They finally got one of the starboard boats launched, and 9 men got into it, including the second mate. The bosun went below and found Captain Lonnen and asked him to join the boat they had just launched, but Captain Lonnen simply replied, "No, I'm going to stop here." That would be the last that Gustav Carlsen would say that he ever heard of the captain. There would be other claims about what others heard the final words of Captain Lonnen to be, including a story where he came onto the companionway and called to the carpenter, quote, "Come down with me, Chips, and we will go down together," an offer that was declined by Reeder. Other sources said that his last words were, quote, "Don't bustle, boys. Don't hurry." No matter which was the final statement of Captain Lonnen, it was evidence of his unwillingness to leave the ship, and the boat departed without him. The first mate also remained on board of the Loch Finlas. Carlsen would report that he believed that the first mate had been injured somehow during the launching of the boat, and that he climbed the rigging, rather than attempting a passage in the boat. He was not alone in the rigging either. Cook and steward had also made the climb up where it seemed safer. Unfortunately, this would not be the case, and as the boat departed the ship, they were able to see the ship slide off of the rock, tip to the side, and sink, taking all on board of her down with her. It was estimated that the time was around 10 or 10:30 when the Loch Finlas finally gave up her fight against the sea. The people in the boat had no way of knowing it, but the plight of the Loch Finlas had been observed from shore. At least 3 of the residents of Cape Portland had seen the ship stuck on the reef, and they had watched with dread as the ship had rocked and grated on the rocks. The seas were too stormy, and the ship was too distant for them to offer any aid, and so they were forced to just observe the ship sink about half an hour after they had first seen her. The observers had seen a couple of people walking on the deck before she sank, but they had not seen any of the boats launch, and therefore the initial reports that were made public in the papers were the observers' statements that an unknown vessel had struck the reef, and that there had been no survivors. In spite of the grim initial report, a rescue ship named the Boobyalla had been dispatched to render aid if any was needed. Fortunately, it would indeed serve its purpose. The 9 men who had escaped from the Loch Finlas were still holding on. Holding on was really all the men could do. The boat they had managed to launch did not have any oars, and so the path that it took was entirely determined by the elements. The boat was soon capsized by the stormy waves, but the 9 men still clung to it. Fortunately, when they had left the ship, they had all been wearing lifebelts, which helped them regain the surface. Behind them, the men could see one man clinging to the ship's gig, and another man clinging to a plank, but they were powerless to offer them aid in their current situation, and they watched as the current swept both of them towards Swan Island. Ship's apprentice Barque would say that he had seen 2 of the other sailors clinging to another boat, but it was further out than they were, and he could not say where it had gone. The waves that had capsized the boat did not cease to batter them, and time and again the men clinging to the boat were washed away. Unfortunately, not everyone would be able to regain the boat again. Though he was modest and brief in his description of the role he had played during this time, his companions would later ensure that Carlson would get full credit for his heroism throughout this time. They described how, at risk of his own life, Carlson would leave the boat and pull people back to safety, as well as assisting the men who were too tired to hold on. It was Carlson, they said, who had kept everyone hopeful and in high spirits throughout the ordeal. Still, their numbers dwindled. The 5th person they lost was a second mate, who seemed to have become delusional. Though no other details were given, it was said that he had begun to sing random snatches of songs and hymns. Twice, Carlson had been able to pull him back to the boat, but towards nightfall, the second mate slipped from the life preserver he had around himself and sank below the surface. All that remained was carpenter Reeder, apprentice Barque, and the 2 sailors Carlson and Dahlgren. The 4 men who were still clinging to the boat had no way of knowing what was ahead of them in the darkness. Behind them was the light of the Swan Island lighthouse, but they had no way of knowing what lay ahead until around midnight, when they found themselves in amongst breakers. After a struggle in which all 4 men were badly bruised, they were able to pull themselves onto the beach. Not able to find their way in the darkness, they huddled together until daybreak, when they followed the beach until they came to a fisherman's house around 9 in the morning, 24 hours after the Loch Finlas had first struck the reef. Here, they were given some food and some boots to wear, and then sent on to another man's house named George Groves, who could offer them even more hospitality, as well as eventual transportation to Cape Portland. The news of the shipwreck preceded the men's trip on to Cape Portland. The operator of the telephone station was called into Grove's home to meet the 4 survivors and hear their stories, and he was able to send the news on that there were survivors of the wreck after all. The Boobyalla, whose progress had been slowed by the same storm that had battered the Loch Finlas, finally arrived in Cape Portland and took on the 4 surviving sailors, who were able to tell the details of what they knew of the wreck, and where it was most likely that any other survivors had drifted to, based on what they had seen. The Boobyalla departed again, leaving the survivors in the safety of Grove's home. But while the search would continue for a little while longer, they would have no luck. The 4 men who had washed up clinging to the boat would prove to be the only 4 survivors out of the crew of 24. Newspapermen had come along on the Boobyalla for her rescue voyage, but they struggled to get news out of what had happened, since the telegraph wires that connected Cape Portland with the outside world kept breaking. Due to the emergency that had taken place, the postal authorities suddenly found themselves under a large amount of pressure to install heavier wiring and maintain communication. With the wiring fixed, the reporters were able to share the story of the men and their ordeal with the outside world, as well as report with finality the name of the ship that had been so tragically lost. The 4 survivors picked Carlson and Barque to speak for them all, and they told the concise account of what had happened. Special interest was taken in Barque, who was only 17, and was on his first voyage when the disaster had struck. He did not seem particularly traumatized, however, and proudly showed the reporters that, though they had been water damaged, he had managed to save the pictures of his family he had been traveling with. The court of inquiry that would follow the loss of the Loch Finlas would not offer much closure. The four men could only say what it was that had happened, but could not say why the ship had been on the course it had been on, and how it had found itself on the reef. None of the survivors were in decision-making roles, and they had not been spoken to about the course they were taking. There were, of course, theories from all sides, and for some time experienced captains found themselves being asked for their opinion about why the Loch Finlas might have found herself in such a position. One theory was that the Loch Finlas might have been driven by the storm too far to the south to go around Tasmania, and so they had decided that the Bass Strait was the easiest solution to their troubles. Another theory was that the fault lay with the Admiralty chart, which did not show Foster Island, where the Loch Finlas had wrecked, even though the government map of Tasmania did show it. A third theory was that, because the tides were against them entering the Bass Strait, they were trying to head for shelter to wait until they would be able to enter the strait, only to strike on the reef. They were not the first vessel to have met its end there, and the area was known to be dangerous for shipping. That was the entire reason why the Swan Island lighthouse had been built in the first place. The court of inquiry was not able to say if any of these theories were the correct one, and the four men who came to stand before them and testify about what had occurred were not the ones who they could place blame on for the wreck, even if an answer was reached. It was true that Captain Lonnen had not been sober for days, but the ship had not been under his command at the time of the accident. The first mate had been sober, and yet the disaster had still occurred. The court of inquiry felt that, in the end, what they could say was that they did not feel that sufficient watch had been kept, or the danger of Foster Island would have been seen, but it was a finding without assigning blame. The people who failed to watch were all lost, and it was a finding that could only serve as a warning for future vessels to avoid the rocks.
For more information, please see the Hobart Mercury from September 28, 1908, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.